gets into something we call general equilibrium, and that's way too complicated for this course. So we are going to ignore those kinds of feedback effects for now. That's something you can learn about more in future courses. But you're right. In principle, it could affect the demand for everything. Okay? You could imagine that as the price of beef goes up, okay, that means that, for example, the cost of restaurant meals goes up. So I'm not going to eat at the restaurant as much, so maybe I'll go to the movies more. So in principle, the price of beef going up could raise the demand for movies. I mean, it's crazy. It's hard to know where to stop. So we're going to make your life easy by stopping it at one level here. But you're right. In principle, there could be these wide range of feedbacks. And that's, once again, I talked in the first lecture about simplifying assumptions. We're going to try to teach you the basic concepts, but try to make simplifying assumptions that make it more manageable. That's the kind of simplifying assumption we'll make for our modeling here in this course. OK, so that's a shift in the demand curve. Yeah?
How do you quantify the shift in the demand curve?
Excellent. And that will be exactly, basically the way we're going to learn this course. We're going to do things a couple of times. We're going to develop, when we talk about producer theory, we will teach you where this supply curve comes from. Basically, firm profit maximizing decisions will determine the supply curve and how much it shifts. And we'll teach you that when we teach you producer theory. So this is sort of a big overview. You're good MIT students, you're immediately thinking, well, where the hell do these demand supply curves come from? That's what we're going to get to. That's the whole point of consumer theory will give us the demand curve. Producer theory will give us the supply curve. All right, good questions. OK, so now let's talk about a different case. Let's talk about a shift in the supply curve. OK, so now let's suppose there's a drought. OK, and let's suppose there's a drought that only affects pork, because if the drought affected beef, that would then have these other feedback effects. Let's imagine there's a pork drought. I don't know what that would mean, but let's imagine that happened. OK, so suddenly it becomes more expensive. Or let's just say there's mad pig disease. Let's imagine there's mad pig disease. OK, so suddenly it becomes more expensive to produce pork. Because there's fewer pigs, it's more expensive to produce it. OK, so what that would do is that would cause a shift in the supply curve, inward or upward of the supply curve. OK, of the supply curve. Suddenly, you get the fact that given that it's more expensive to produce pork, suppliers say, well, gee, to produce a given amount of pork, I need to get paid a higher price. So we get, once again, initially, if the price stayed constant, so now I'm on figure 2.3. If the price stayed constant, we would not begin with excess demand. Because if the price stayed constant, then consumers, OK, would want 220 million kilograms of pork, which is what they wanted before. Nothing's changed from their perspective. But producers would say, look, at that price, I can only now produce 205, because my supply curve shifted up. So once again, you have to move to a new equilibrium where suppliers and consumers are happy. That will happen at a point like E2. Okay? Because at E2, given the higher price of producing pork, producers will now say, OK, I'm happy to sell 215 million kilograms at $3.55. And consumers will say, well, gee, at $3.55, I don't want quite as much as I wanted before. I only want 215. And they're happy. Here's what's striking. We had two very different phenomena. We had demand shift and a supply shift. Both led to the same outcome. I'm sorry, both led to a higher price. Sorry, not the same outcome. Both led to price. One led to higher demand, to higher quantity sold in the market. So go back to figure 2.2. The price went up and the quantity in the market went up from 220 to 228. In figure 2.3, when the supply shift happened, the price also went up, almost exactly the same amount. But here the quantity fell. So you can't tell from a price increase what happened. If the price of pork goes up, you can't tell me whether that was a demand or supply shift. You need to know both the price and quantity to be able to tell me that. Okay? Both changes led to the same outcome in terms of prices. Okay, questions about that? OK, now let's make it interesting. Now let's ask what happens. So we have the supply and demand equilibrium. Supply shifts, demand shifts. You move the points. You guys can all do it graphically, even if you don't quite get it intuitively yet. OK, now let's ask what happens if the government comes in and messes this up. Now, step aside to my other hat. The other course I teach is called Public Economics, which is all about the role of the government in the economy. Okay? That course is, in this course, most of what you'll learn is there's a clear role of the government in the economy. It's to screw it up. Okay? Economics is fundamentally a right-wing science. Okay? Okay, most of my colleagues are Democrats, but that doesn't change the fact of what we teach. It's fundamentally very conservative, which is the market knows best, and governments just mess things up. Now, later in the semester, we'll talk about why that might not be true. And the whole point of my other course, 1441, is to talk about why that might not be true and where governments can make things worse and better. But from your basic perspective, you need to be indoctrinated with this fundamental position that the market gets it right. The market equilibrates, governments mess things up. Okay? And that's sort of where we'll start. So let's talk about the classic example of government messing things up, the minimum wage. Okay, you all heard of the minimum wage. Good thing, workers get paid more. That seems like a good thing. Well, in fact, to economists, it's a bad thing. And let's talk about why. Okay, to many economists, at least this initial analysis is a bad thing. We'll come back later as to why it might not be so bad. To do that, let's talk about equilibrium, not in a market for goods, like pork, but in a market for inputs, which is labor. Labor is an input to the production process. We'll talk about this at great length later in the semester. But the key thing is, just like there's a market for pork, where the equilibrium outcome is the price you pay for pork and the amount of pork sold, there's a market for labor. And in that market, things are flipped. Who are the consumers now? Well, they're the firms. The firms demand labor. Who are suppliers now? Well, they're you. They're the people. People supply labor. So now we flip things on its head. The suppliers are the people. The demanders are the firms. But the analysis is the same. This basic supply-demand framework, which will turn to be so powerful this semester, can be used even though we flip the labels of who's on what side. So you see in figure 2.4, we have a labor market with an upward sloping supply curve. What does that mean? Why is the supply curve upward sloping? Because the higher your wage, the more you're willing to work. Okay? And we have a downward sloping demand curve. Why is it downward sloping? Because the higher the wage, the fewer workers the firm wants to hire. It would rather use machines instead. Okay? So basically, you've got that same supply and demand curve, different stories as to where they come from, but the same effect in terms of determining equilibrium. We get an equilibrium at W1 L star, okay, which is at a wage W1, L star workers are willing to work, okay, or L star hours are supplied of labor. We think about hours supplied, not necessarily number of workers. L star hours of labor are supplied. And at that W1, L star workers are willing to provide L star hours, and at that W1, firms demand L star hours, and that's the equilibrium. Okay? Same analysis before, just different stories as to what's behind the curve. Now, let's say the government rolled in and set, as in figure 2.5, a minimum wage. The government says, look, that wage W1 is too low, or W star in this graph is too low. Workers are not paid enough in equilibrium. We need to make sure that they get paid a minimum amount. So we're going to mandate that workers cannot be paid below W lower bar, which is above, critically above W star. Well, what happens in that case? Well, in that case, at that wage, workers are thrilled. They say, look, at that wage, we are delighted to work, God, the numbers are, I'm getting old. LS, hours. I have my prescription for my bifocals. I've had it for like 2 months, and I just can't quite take it to the mall and get them. So eventually I get them. I just can't quite admit I'm that old. Okay, so workers are like, great. At that wage, we'll supply L sub S hours. Okay? That sounds great to us. We're all good. But the firm says, wait a second. No, we don't want to hire L sub S hours at that wage. That's way too high. We only want to hire at that high wage L sub D hours. Okay? So suddenly you have a case of excess supply, not excess demand, excess supply. Workers want to supply more hours than firms want to hire. Now, in our previous example, what would happen? What would happen is if there's excess supply, well, let me ask you, if there's excess supply in a market, how would the market equilibrate? What would happen? Yeah?
Lower the price so that
in this case, the price is what?
The number of...
The wage. The wage. So exactly. In our previous example, the wage would fall. Workers would suck it up and get a lower wage. Firms would be happy to pay a lower wage. You'd reach a point where they were happy. Okay? You'd reach a point like E.